Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Missouri Department of Economic Development training on infrastructure programs for CDBG DR and CDBG mitigation programs. My name is Stacy Weineck. I'm from Guidehouse. We are working with the Department of Economic Development to assist with their policy development and training on their programs. I have about 8 years of CDBG experience, so I'm looking forward to working with these programs. I'm joined by my colleague, Sally Hemingway, who additionally has an extensive career with various CDBG programs. We will get into the content. So as an overview of the training, we will start with introductions of the overview of the different programs as well as the applicable disasters. The next section is going to be cross-cutting federal regulations and CDBG applicability. Then we'll move into the category compliance that is specific to all infrastructure activities. Okay, and then this training does cover 3 different infrastructure programs. So we will move into the specific categories: infrastructure in support of housing, general infrastructure, and then finally infrastructure mitigation. And we'll close out the training with some monitoring, closeout, and further compliance. So just as a general overview for the 3 different programs, so general infrastructure funded with CDBG DR funding. This program is intended to engage just general infrastructure activities, which include but are not limited to rehabilitation, replacement, and/or relocation of critical damaged public facilities after a disaster event. And these activities are standalone. They do not need to be associated with a housing activity. Okay, infrastructure mitigation are going to be projects that will utilize the CDBG MIT, also known as CDBG mitigation funding for activities, and these activities are looking to increase resilience to disasters and reduce or eliminate the long-term risk of loss of life, injury, damage to and loss of property, and suffering and hardship by lessening the impact of future disasters. Okay, and the last program that we're going to cover in this training is the infrastructure in support of housing. So this program is also funded with CDBG DR funding, and this program is intended to engage in infrastructure activities that specifically support the housing-related activities. Okay, there are 2 applicable disasters that these programs will look to address. The first one is DR 4317, and this is in response to a series of storms that occurred in 2017. So these storms included tornadoes, straight-line winds, and flooding that all occurred in the spring of 2017. So all 3 infrastructure programs are covered under DR 4317. Okay, and the second disaster is DR 4451. This is in response to storms that occurred in 2019, which also included heavy rains, straight-line winds, flooding, and tornadoes. Okay, and the only program that is covered under DR 4451 will be the Infrastructure in Support of Housing program. Okay, so next we're going to move into the cross-cutting federal regulations, and for that, I'm going to pass it over to Sally.
Thank you, Stacy, and good morning, everyone. Cross-cutting regulations stem from laws that apply across all federal agencies, including the CDBG program. Cross-cutting regs guide compliance with the use of federal funds. In many ways, they ensure protections to what may otherwise be vulnerable entities, or they protect any misuse of funds. Examples of cross-cutting regulations include financial management, environmental review, labor standards, acquisition and relocation, and fair housing. And in this section, we'll review some of those cross-cutting regs. Remember, each of these regulations can easily have a whole training dedicated to itself. We're just going to touch on them so that you have the awareness and maybe some resources to address them more fully. Of course, HUD has a toolkit on the HUD Exchange, and DED has its CDBG compliance manual. The first one we're going to touch on is the environmental review. The National Environmental Policy Act requires each project funded with federal dollars to undergo a review to determine impacts, both positive and negative, on the environment. It's a series of steps that force an evaluation and thought process that will ultimately identify impacts through each action and activity that's proposed under the project. The environmental review must be complete prior to the release of CDBG funds. No project work can start prior to the completion of the ER. This includes acquisition and construction activities. When the ER is successfully completed, including the proper paperwork maintained in the file and the required public comment periods, the state will provide a release of funds, a written release of funds, at which time project activities can start. The environmental review contains different categories or levels of review that a project may fall into, depending on the type of project and the specific activities undertaken. The first is the environmental assessment, or EA. This is the category that most of the CDBG funded activities fall into. It generally covers rehabilitation, new construction, demolition, and minor changes in land use. It's used when your evaluation concludes a minor beneficial impact, no impact at all, or a minor adverse impact that you may further mitigate in your activities. Your conclusion in this part of the environmental assessment is a finding of no significant impact. The second category is the environmental impact statement. This is a highly detailed level of review and evaluation that's required when your assessment results in a finding of significant impact. These are projects that anticipate major changes to the environment. The next two describe defined actions when there's a minimal or no physical impact to the environment. They include the categorically excluded subject to Part 58.5, which includes narrowly defined activities where the project will not create more than a 20% change in size or capacity. These include activities like ADA improvements or replacing existing water or sewer lines or reconstructing curbs and sidewalks. The key to this category is the project is only touching previously disturbed land. It's not expanding or extending anything. The final category we'll discuss is the categorically excluded, not subject to Part 58.5. And here we're talking about activities that have no physical impact at all. These are things like supportive services, planning, some professional services like engineering and audit. The things that are a part of the line item of your overall budget, but really are activities that have no impact. They're not involved in turning a shovel or touching any property. Each determined level of review drives the actions that you must take to complete the environmental review process. This slide provides the steps that you undertake in the process. You define it, you determine the level of review, that you perform the environmental review, you finalize the review, you expend the project funds, and then you do a post-review consideration. In the process of that, for every step, you are building and maintaining the environmental review record. That record has to be kept on file with the project files at both the state and local level. It's important to note if anything changes in your project scope as your project progresses, you must determine if a further environmental review is required. The next category we'll talk about is the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Section 104D Act, commonly known as the URA. It protects the process and parties involved when the government or government funds are buying your property. The Uniform Relocation Act includes methods for purchase, including proper notifications, acceptable means for determining property values, the process to make offers, negotiations, and the steps you go through to assure equitable treatment for all parties involved. The URA also covers relocation and displacement and benefits that you may be entitled to if you have to find a new residence or a business location. And that may be on a temporary basis or on a permanent basis. Surprising to many, there are benefits available to a business if their operations are interrupted or if they're relocated temporarily or permanently as a result of a CDBG project. HUD encourages activities that cause minimal or no displacement, but occasionally in the process of a project, it does occur. The approach to addressing displaced businesses includes an evaluation of their specific need so that the appropriate resources can be provided. This may include things like finding available sites for businesses to resume operations, creating and deploying advisory services so that they can provide professional information and advice to businesses that are facing a disruption or dislocation. And finally, businesses that may be eligible for relocation benefits to cover moving and other eligible expenses. Another category is program income. And program income occurs when you actually make money when you're using CDBG funds. Administrative actions are required when you generate more than $35,000 in any 1 year. Program income typically occurs if you sell land that was purchased with CDBG funds or if you earn interest on deposits of CDBG funds. Anytime you make money and that money totals more than $35,000, you're subject to the rules of program income. If it occurs, the subrecipient must notify DED for specific direction, and the state has to track the program income in its DRGR computer system. All of that tracking results in that, culminates in the required reporting to HUD. DED requires payments be made to them, may require payments be made to them of program income so that DED can redistribute those funds to other eligible projects, or DED may provide written permission to use any program income for further eligible disaster recovery activities. It's very important for the subrecipient to work hand in hand with the Department of Economic Development on what they're allowed to do with their program income. The next category or next act we'll talk about is Fair Labor Standards. Fair Labor Standards is another cross-cutting law. It's administered and enforced by the U.S. Department of Labor. Fair Labor Standards covers such things as minimum wage rates and how overtime is calculated and valued. Sometimes other labor standards laws that are applicable to CDBG may be more stringent than the Fair Labor Standards Act. And in that case, those laws would preempt the Fair Labor Standards Act. So this act should be viewed as the baseline or the starting threshold for compliance with labor standards. One example of a more stringent law is Davis-Bacon and related acts. The Davis-Bacon introduces us to the concept of prevailing wages, which are wages experienced on similar work when in similar industries and similar job classifications. Davis-Bacon applies to construction, alteration, or repairs made to public buildings or public works, and it's projects that are valued more than $2,000. Each class of worker has a wage determination assigned to them that includes both the base wage and fringe. And compliance of Davis-Bacon is achieved through the submission of certified payrolls showing the proper wages on a weekly basis. It should be noted that Davis-Bacon is the floor of the wage level in each wage classification that must be paid. Contractors, general contractors, subcontractors can certainly pay their workers more than the threshold level that Davis-Bacon requires. Missouri is a prevailing wage state, meaning that it also provides, publishes, and requires a determined wage amount on public works projects. In Missouri, the threshold for projects is valued at $75,000 or more for its applicability. CDBG projects are required to obtain both the federal and the state wage determinations applicable to each project and evaluate the worker class and make sure that the payment is the higher of the two. Okay, so it's whether it's the federal wage or the Missouri state wage, you must assure compliance by paying the higher of the two. Subrecipients are encouraged to review the other related documents. There is a prevailing wage law checkoff list, and there's an affidavit of compliance with prevailing wage law, which contractors must submit prior to the Department of Labor prior to requesting the final payment of public funds. The forms are available on the CDBG website, and they are linked to both the federal websites and the Missouri Department of Labor website as well. The items on this next slide are additional notes about the process, including where you might find acceptable weekly payroll document, which includes all the required detail and content. The website also shows the rules around submitting prevailing wage documents in their form and using the right format. The next cross-cutting law is Section 3. And Section 3 is a part of the Housing and Urban Development Act that requires CDBG funds to direct employment, training, and contractor opportunities to low-income individuals and businesses within the community. HUD recognizes the buying power of the CDBG funds and desires to gain a kind of a second benefit by opening doors to low-income persons and businesses on its projects that it funds. So in addition to the benefits that are captured by the project itself, HUD also wants its grantees, subrecipients, and contractors to focus on providing the means to open doors to low income. Section 3 defines workers, targeted workers, and businesses. And it creates benchmarks for participation and requires reporting on how well best efforts are achieving and creating opportunities. Each contract executed that may have possible means to expect an opportunity will include Section 3 benefits and benchmarks and will require reporting back to the subrecipient, who will ultimately then report back to DED and then ultimately to HUD. The table on this slide shows who makes up a Section 3 worker, who makes up a targeted worker, and who makes up a Section 3 business concern. It also shows what the targeted benchmarks for participation are. And again, best efforts must be made to achieve those. It's important to note the applicability of Section 3 to construction activity types. HUD is trying to open doors where unskilled or workers who can be trained on the job can enter the workforce. They aren't talking about creating or requiring Section 3 on contracts for legal services or specialized professional services. It's really specific to construction activity types. This slide shows examples of forms that are used in the Section 3 process. You can see one is applicable to Section 3 businesses, one is to Section 3 workers or targeted workers, and one that helps the subrecipients define the income limits so that contractors can understand who Section 3 workers and targeted workers may be. The next cross-cutting measure is Section 504, and Section 504 is part of the Rehabilitation Act. It provides protections from discrimination for disabled persons and assures access to projects and project benefits. While both Section 504 and the Americans with Disabilities Act are civil rights acts, Section 504 applies to entities that receive federal dollars, and the ADA applies to virtually every entity in the country, except churches and private clubs. The National Affordable Housing Act is also known as the Cranston-Gonzalez Act. In part, the National Affordable Housing Act directs equal opportunity within the Act's general provisions. You can tell merely by the fact that we're talking about Section 281 that the National Affordable Housing Act is a large act. And within that, in Section 281, it directs equal opportunity in a very specific way. That provision provides the requirement for the existence of a minority outreach program, and part of such a program includes defining and certifying minority and women-owned businesses for each participating jurisdiction. So what the bulleted items on the slide show are what in the state of Missouri a business must meet in order to become a certified minority women-owned business, or a MBEWB, commonly known. Okay, so those bulleted items are how Missouri achieves that compliance. And then you as a subrecipient and potential contractor also are subject to it. And finally, the last cross-cutting measure we want to talk about is the Citizen Participation Plan. The state CDBG program has adopted a very specific citizen participation plan for its disaster recovery grantees and sub-recipients that describes the methods and opportunities that projects must take to engage the public in the process. The state plan identifies the number and the timing of public hearings, the acceptance and the means and timing around publicizing those hearings, and the purpose and goals of citizen participation. It also includes the process of providing technical assistance to any population that may need it in order to gain access and to be part of the process as a citizen of the community where the project is taking place. Citizen participation extends to the efforts of the unit of general local government subrecipient. So the state plan talks about its own citizen participation efforts, but it also extends to every subrecipient that it provides funding to. You can tell and you can see as part of the success of any project is the extent to which the citizenry is supportive of the project. It's very hard to find a successful project that has a lot of opposition from local homeowners and citizens. And so it's a very, very important part of the project. And that concludes that section, and I'll turn it back over to Stacy.
Thanks, Sally. All right, I don't see that we have any questions, so we'll just continue to the next section. So the next section is category compliance for all infrastructure activities. So whereas the cross-cutting measures that Sally discussed are applicable to all CDBG DR funded programs, this section is going to talk about the requirements that are specific to infrastructure activities. Okay, so first we're going to talk about project planning. When planning the project, it's important to keep in mind what are eligible and ineligible costs for all program activities. Okay, so some examples of eligible costs are going to be any costs that are associated with the acquisition of any real property for the purpose of implementing the infrastructure project. Okay, it also includes capital costs, which are materials and labor of construction. So, really direct material costs, labor costs needed for the implementation of the project. Okay, eligible costs also include soft costs. So those are, generally any indirect costs that are required for the implementation of the program, but are not, directly related to construction or material. So these can include professional services, insurance, fees, and any other pre- and post-construction expenses. Okay, and then generally speaking, activities that are ineligible would involve any activities that are related to buildings for the general conduct of government, for example, any improvements to a city hall, any general government expenses, and any political activities. Okay, so when implementing any CDBG DR funded project, two really important things to keep in mind are the disaster tieback and the project location. So disaster tieback just means that all activities being implemented under the project must demonstrate how they meet an unmet need and how they respond directly or indirectly to an impact of the federally declared disasters. So in this case, we're talking about DR 4317 and DR 4451, which we discussed earlier. Okay, there is an exception for activities that are funded with CDBG MIT. Any of those activities do not need to show a direct tie back to the disaster, but we will get into that in more detail when we talk about the specific CDBG MIT activities. Okay, additionally, all CDBG funded activities must be located within a county that is designated by the relevant disaster declaration. Okay, so when looking at all of the projects overall, DED will prioritize any project that is located within the MID, and the MID being the most impacted and distressed areas, and additionally areas that qualify as LMI. Okay, and then the second priority will be given to projects that do serve the LMI areas, but that are not located in the MID areas. Okay, and then lastly, any project located in the MID that does not serve LMI will be given third priority, and non-LMI and non-MID projects will be given fourth priority. Okay, so in speaking of priority being given to LMI projects, we're going to move into the national objective section. So all projects that are funded with CDBG dollars must meet one of the three national objectives. Okay, and those three national objectives are benefit to low and moderate income persons, also known as LMI. The second one is activities that aid in the prevention and or elimination of slum or blight. And the third activity is those that meet a particular urgent need. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, all activities must meet at least one of those national objectives. Okay, I know we talked about three different national objectives, but we do often refer to LMI as the primary national objective because there is an additional requirement for all grantees that the overall grant award is spent, 70% of that is spent on LMI persons. Okay, so that's why there is priority given to individual projects that will achieve the LMI national objective. Okay, and so because of this requirement, it is expected that activities that address slum or blight or urgent need are limited in order to meet that 70% LMI expenditure. Okay, and when looking at how to determine whether or not a project benefits LMI persons, there are a few different tests that we can look at. But since we're talking about infrastructure activities under this category, we're really going to focus on the area benefit category, also known as LMA, because that is the most commonly used test to determine the benefit under an infrastructure project. Okay, so an area benefit category is when the project activity benefits all residents in a particular area, but that area is at least 51% LMI persons. Okay, and it is the responsibility of the grantee to determine the service area of an activity. Okay, so again, just to emphasize, with LMA, you're looking at the total areas served, and that area needs to be predominantly somewhere than 51% LMI residents. Okay, the next category we're going to talk about is duplication of benefits. So all activities funded by the CDBG-DR program must undergo a duplication of benefits review prior to an award of funds. This will also occur at project closeout. As we know, during the life of a project, a lot of things can change. So once again, at project closeout, there will be another duplication of benefits review just to ensure that no additional funding was received and nothing with regards to the award amount has changed. So a DOB occurs when a program beneficiary or a subrecipient receives assistance from multiple sources for the same purpose. Okay, so to just emphasize on that, oftentimes projects will have additional funding sources. DOB is really just looking to make sure that those outside fundings, if there are outside funding sources, that they do not cover the same activities and they are not for the same time period and for the same amount of assistance. Okay. And so really that's just to ensure that, any program beneficiary or subrecipient is not receiving more funding than is needed to implement the program. And again, is not receiving funding for the same activities. So it is the grantee's responsibility to ensure that the program provides assistance only to the extent that the disaster recovery has not been met fully by funds that have already been awarded. So again, as I just mentioned, there can be multiple funding sources. We are just looking to make sure that it is not for the same purpose of the other funding. Okay, so before an award is made, the subrecipient must submit documentation of all funds that are obtained from any other source, starting from the date of the disaster, at the date of application, during implementation, and the closeout phase. So just to kind of give some examples of where other funding might come from, it may include, but is not limited to, FEMA payments, SBA payments, that includes private insurance, any other grants, or any other source of funds that are going, again, to the same program activities for the same project. Okay, DED will review and verify the DOB information provided. They're going to do that by looking at partner agency databases. And again, this will occur prior to an award being made, throughout the project lifecycle, and again, as part of project closeout, just to make sure, again, that no funding has changed, no additional funding has been received during the life of the project. Okay, so the order of assistance was created just to kind of help understand how to avoid duplication of benefits. So FEMA has provided guidance as far as the order of assistance, just to make sure that we are preventing any DOBs. Okay, so the order of assistance is a delivery sequence that establishes the order in which disaster relief agencies can respond and provide assistance. Excuse me. As a general rule of thumb, a CDBG is considered the funding of last resort. So that basically means that once all other avenues and options have been exhausted, that's when CDBG will come and step in. So just as an example, the order of assistance for infrastructure projects will generally be, the first place where funding might come from would be voluntary agencies, emergency assistance, insurance, and that does include flood insurance when applicable. Okay, after insurance, we can look at FEMA public assistance funding. The next would be Economic Development Administration, other state funds, and then again, once all of those other avenues have been exhausted, that's where the Missouri CDBG program will come in. Okay, so the next topic is risk assessment. So there is, ongoing monitoring and compliance during the life of the project, and a risk assessment will be conducted in order to determine the level of monitoring that will be required. Okay, so there are a number of factors that are taken into consideration when looking at a risk assessment. So I won't read through all of these, but just a few examples are, if the subrecipient or entity has implemented a similar project before, and if so, was the project successful? Really just ensuring that they have all of the systems in place for successful implementation. And that includes having the appropriate level of staffing, and again, staff that is familiar with the process and has worked on similar projects. Okay. Any prior experience with federal grants would be taken into consideration, as well as financial capacity of the subrecipient. Okay, so during the life of the project, the subrecipient does have a number of responsibilities. This is just kind of a general overview. Of course, there are, additional responsibilities as we discussed during the cross-cutting section, but just to highlight a few of the main responsibilities for subrecipients. Subrecipients are required to follow standard procurement policies, standard procurement practices. And that will include anytime there is a bid opportunity that must be submitted to DED in a timely manner. Okay. Also, when engaging in both procurement and determination of budgets, subrecipients must ensure that cost verification is conducted. Okay. And lastly, subrecipients are responsible for scheduling all inspections that are required during the implementation of the project, and they must invite DED to attend those inspections. Okay, and as we talked about on the previous slide, there is a lot of monitoring and compliance that will occur during the project. So there are certain reports that will be required by the subrecipients to be submitted to DED for inclusion on the website. And those include quarterly progress reports, also known as QPRs, as well as a summary of all procured contracts. Okay, now we're going to talk about the maximum amount of assistance. And so this is just for on a project level, what is the maximum award that can be made for each project? So we'll get into this in a little bit more detail when we talk about the specific projects, but we can find the maximum amount to be awarded per project in the relevant DR action plan. Okay, so as mentioned on the subrecipient responsibility slide, we talked about cost effectiveness. So all subrecipients who receive CDBG funding are required to assess the cost effectiveness of all construction projects relative to other alternatives by deploying a cost reasonable test prior to the award being made. Okay, so that just basically means, when looking to implement a construction project, is, the type of construction, the type of rehab, is it cost effective compared to any other alternative for repair or reconstruction? Okay, so although there is a maximum amount of awards set for each project, the state of Missouri may make exceptions to that amount based on their exception policy. So if there is a need for an award that goes above the maximum amount, a request must be made in writing along with justification that must be submitted to Missouri DED, which will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. Okay, and DED does have a responsibility to review that request and respond within 5 business days. Okay, when submitting a proposal, the applicant must include a project budget. So that budget should include all project costs attributable to the development of the infrastructure, and it must include all of the other proposed and secured funding. So again, we talked about duplication of benefits earlier. So as mentioned, it is allowable for there to be additional funding sources, but those the additional funds must be committed before any CDBG DR award is made. Okay, so must be secured, and the applicant must be able to assure that the full project budget will be met either through CDBG funding or other sources. Okay, so project budget amendments, so as I mentioned before, throughout the life of a project, unfortunately, we all know that things don't always go as planned. There may be a need for a budget amendment, which can include an increase to the budget. So budget amendments are allowable, but they must be related directly to a change in the program service or activity. Okay, and again, we put a lot of emphasis on cost verification. So anytime there is a request for a change in a budget, it must be accompanied by a cost verification and cost reasonableness test. Okay, so all requests for changes to the original approved budget must be done by submitting a funding approval and grant agreement amendment request form to the assigned compliance specialist. So again, that form will be subject to review by DED. Okay, and sometimes, a change in budget may also be accompanied by a change in scope. So any change in scope must also be approved by DED. Okay, so just to talk about change in scope a little bit more. So there are things to consider if there is going to be a change in scope. So if there is a change in scope, you must look at whether it's going to change the service area or the beneficiaries as identified in the application. So again, as mentioned previously, all projects must meet a national objective. Therefore, if the service area does change due to a change in scope, there must be documentation provided to show that the new or revised service area does continue to meet the national objective under which the application was first approved. Okay, so if the intent was to meet an LMI national objective, if the service area changes, there must be documentation to show that the LMI national objective will still be met. Okay, additionally, any change in scope may alter the environmental review. In the event that there is a change to the environmental review, a revision must be prepared and submitted as well. So in the event that there is a change in scope which affects the service area and therefore the national objective is no longer going to be met, or if there is a decrease in the number of beneficiaries, the project must be deobligated. Okay, and again, as we mentioned, it is a requirement to meet a national objective. Therefore, if the project no longer meets that national objective, funding must be deobligated. In the event that that happens, the subrecipient may choose to submit a new proposal during the next available application cycle, which documents the new national objective. Okay, so we also mentioned that one of the subrecipient's responsibilities is procurement. So subrecipients must comply with procurement policies, and generally speaking, CDBG-DR requirements are that procurements are based on full and open competition, and that they require an evaluation of the cost or price of the product or service. Okay, so just really ensuring that all procurements were open, there was no bias, there was no collusion, and that all costs are reasonable and justified. Okay, infrastructure projects will generally require the service of engineers, contractors, and inspectors, and may also include other specialists depending on the project. Okay, so when entering into a contract for any of the services mentioned above, all contracts must clearly state the period of performance or date of completion, and they also must incorporate performance requirements, insurance requirements, and liquidated damages. Okay, cost verification. I know that we have talked about this a lot so far, but now we'll kind of talk through exactly what that means and how to go about the process of cost verification. So as mentioned, when it comes to both procurement and when it comes to project budget determination, it is required that cost control measures are implemented and that all reimbursable costs are verified and correctly controlled during the project. Okay, so, again, we've talked about cost verification. We haven't really given a true definition of it, but a cost verification, or also known as cost analysis, involves the review and evaluation of the separate cost elements of a proposal as needed to determine a fair and reasonable price. Okay, there are a few different ways that you can go about conducting a cost analysis. So just a few examples are the verification of the necessity for and the reasonableness of a proposed cost. Okay, you can also look at projections of cost trends based on current or historical data. And another method is to compare proposed costs from other proposals for the same or similar terms. Okay, and I always like to think of it of, if you're making a purchase for personal use, if you're doing repairs on your house, you're not just going to go with the first contractor. You're just going to make sure that all costs proposed are reasonable with kind of what your expectations are and what the market is saying is reasonable. So additional examples of cost verification include development of thorough, detailed cost estimates. So prior going to bid, it is a requirement to conduct an independent cost estimate. So again, before the bids are sent, coming up with the determination of what would be considered a reasonable bid amount. Okay, it can also include on-site inspections and reports and third-party evaluation of costs. Okay, so cost verification is always required when non-competitive proposals are used and when price competition is lacking. Okay, another thing to keep in mind with procurement is to avoid any conflicts of interest and identity of interest. Okay, so no person who is an employee, agent, officer, or elected official of the entity receiving CDBG funds may obtain a financial interest from the CDBG assisted activity or have an interest in any contract, subcontract, or agreement. Okay, so you just need to make sure that There is a clear separation between any contractors that are brought on for the project and any, again, employees or officers of the entity receiving the funds. Okay, and then identity of interest means any relationship which could reasonably create or allow for the assumption that there may have been collusion to establish the acquisition price of a property, the cost of rehabilitation, or the terms of financing. Okay, so when we talked about, open and fair competition during procurement, this is really what we're talking about. Just looking to avoid any trace that there could be any sort of collusion. Okay, next we will move into design requirements. Okay, so when looking at any projects that involve the elevation of non-resident or the construction of any non-residential structures, there are some elevation requirements. So when any project is located in either a 100-year floodplain or a 500-year floodplain, the structures must be elevated to a certain level. So when looking at the 100-year floodplain, elevation is required when assistance is being received for any new construction, repair of substantial damage, or a substantial improvement to a non-residential structure. The requirement for this is that the structure must be elevated with the lowest floor, and that does include the basement, to at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation. Okay, and then the 500-year floodplain. So again, it's required for the same for 100-year floodplain, but it does also include any activity that involves critical actions. Okay, so critical actions are some examples of that would be a hospital, a nursing home, a police station, fire station, utility lines. Okay, and just to kind of give some context about what a critical action is, it's when the activity, if there was even a slight chance of flooding, it would be so great that it would result in the loss of life, injury to persons, or damage to property. So again, when you look at the examples we talked about, hospitals, nursing homes, it would just be too great of a risk if there was any chance of flooding. So again, the requirement for the 500-year floodplain is that the structure must be elevated to the higher of the 500-year floodplain elevation, or at least 3 feet above the 100-year floodplain elevation. Okay, so additionally, when there is any construction or reconstruction of any structures, the buildings must meet energy efficiency and green building standards. Okay, so according to the Federal Register, all contractors are required to use green building standards on all construction projects. And these standards must meet an industry recognized standard that has achieved certification under one of the following programs. So just a few examples is the Enterprise Green Communities, LEED, Energy Star, or any equivalent comprehensive green building program that is acceptable to HUD. Okay, so in talking about green building standards, all rehab and new construction projects should be designed to incorporate principles of sustainability, such as water and energy efficiency, resilience, and mitigation measures. Okay, so when submitting an application for any project that involves a structure, the applicant must identify in the application which green building standard will be used, and that must be accompanied by the checklist provided by the relevant program or agency. Okay, then we'll move into construction. So during construction, we already talked about some of the subrecipient responsibilities. So this slide will highlight some of the contractor responsibilities. Okay, so the contractor is responsible for obtaining all local and state permits that will be needed to execute the project. Okay, additionally, they must ensure that all construction complies with local building and occupancy codes. Okay, so this includes federal, state, and local code requirements. The contractor must post all notices on the construction site in a public-facing area. Okay, so just some examples of public notices that may be required are the notice of commencement, notice of public work, notice of prevailing wage, which Sally mentioned earlier, notice of completion, and so on. Okay, the contractor is also required to purchase and maintain all appropriate insurance policies. Okay, during bidding and procurement, they will be required to present bid, performance, and payment costs and bonds as required. Okay, they also, some examples of some of the insurance that might be required is general liability, automobile liability, workers' comp, and disability. Okay, and lastly, as Sally mentioned previously, during the cross-cutting, the contractor must ensure that there is compliance with all state and federal labor standards. So that includes prevailing wage laws, and ensuring that all employees and self-employed workers are paid prevailing wages. Okay, so on that note, contractors will be required to submit certified payrolls to confirm that that all labor standards are being met. Okay, and then lastly, with that, subrecipients will be required to perform employee interviews on the job site again to ensure that all prevailing wages are being met. Okay, so we talked about change orders a little bit in the context of budget amendments. So we'll just kind of walk through the process for submitting a change order if a change order is required. Okay, so change orders are managed at the subrecipient level, but they must also be reviewed by DED. So change orders are permissible, as we mentioned, things happen. Sometimes, we have unexpected activities that occur on the job site, but it is important to keep in mind that too many change orders may trigger additional monitoring of the subrecipient by DED. Okay, and also, as we mentioned before, any change order that involves a budget or a contract, a change to the contract price must be accompanied by a cost verification. Okay, so the process for submitting a change order is if and when the contractor discovers that a change order may be necessary, they will submit the change order to the responsible entity, so the subrecipient, and again, it must be accompanied by a cost reasonableness justification and any other supporting documentation that may be required. As we mentioned before, if the change order results in a change in scope, it must be verified that the environmental assessment will not be impacted. Okay, a change order will not be approved until it is confirmed that the environmental will not be affected. Okay, if the change order causes an increase to the cost of the project, the budget will be reviewed to make sure that there are available funds. If there are not, as we discussed earlier, a budget revision may be allowable, but will definitely need to be reviewed and again accompanied by cost verification. Okay, once the change order is approved by the subrecipient, the project manager will provide the contractor with written approval to proceed. Okay, again, sometimes a change order is required and there may not be time to go through that formal process. So in the event of an emergency change order, the contractor and project manager will both have the authority to issue any necessary emergency change orders without the prior written approval of the subrecipient. However, if that does occur, it is the responsibility of the contractor and project manager to notify the subrecipient within 24 hours after issuance that the emergency change order has occurred. Okay, so just like a regular change order, an emergency change order must be accompanied by a justification for the need, and all copies of the emergency change order must be provided to the subrecipient. Okay. Once all that is done, the emergency change order still will need to be approved by the subrecipient after the fact and submitted to DED. Okay, and this goes for both, regular change orders and emergency change orders. The architect or engineer will be responsible for any increase in cost that is due to an error and or omissions. Okay, so again, if the change order is not justified, if it was a result of an error or omission, the architect or engineer will have to bear the additional cost of that. In this slide, we're going to talk about all the requirements that are involved when implementing a project that involves any flood control structures. So anytime a subrecipient is using CDBG DR or CDBG MIT funds to assist flood control structures, which includes a dam or a levee, it is prohibited that those funds are used to enlarge the original footprint of the structure that existed before the disaster event. Okay, so it can be used for repair. It cannot be used to change the original footprint of the structure. Okay, anytime that DR or MIT funds are being used for a levee or a dam, there are certain requirements. Documentation needs to be filed. So the first requirement is that they register and maintain entries regarding any of these structures with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer National Levee Database or the National Inventory of Dams. Okay, so the slide provides some, the website of where, how to go about registering these structures. Okay, it is also the subrecipient responsibility to ensure that the structure is admitted to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer rehabilitation program. Okay. Additionally, the structure, it must be ensured that the structure is accredited under the FEMA National Flood Insurance Plan. Okay, the subrecipient also must provide the state with the exact location of the structure, the area served and protected by the structure, and that information will be entered by the state into the DRGR system. And lastly, the subrecipient must maintain file documentation demonstrating that there has been a risk assessment conducted before any funding is obligated to the flood control structure. Okay, flood insurance. So this is a big one. So the grantee and the subrecipient must implement procedures and mechanisms to ensure that any property owner that is assisted with CDBG, DR, or MIT funds comply with all flood insurance requirements. Okay, so this includes the following purchase and notification requirements prior to providing assistance. Okay, so any HUD-assisted property that is located in the special flood hazard area must obtain and maintain flood insurance in the amount and duration prescribed by FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. Okay, it is also mandated that flood insurance is purchased for any HUD-assisted property within a special flood hazard area. Okay, I don't see that there's any questions, so we will move on to the next category. And I will pass it back to Sally for this section.
Thank you, Stacy. There are three types of infrastructure programs, as you recall, in Stacy's introduction of this training that we're going to discuss today under the umbrella of the broader infrastructure activity category. And those are the infrastructure in support of housing, which we'll talk about first, general infrastructure, and then we'll follow up with mitigation. It's important to note that all of the programs designed by DED under the infrastructure category meet the needs that they found in the assessment that they did, that the needs that stem from the relevant disasters. So for infrastructure in support of housing, you might be aware that following the recent disasters, HUD's primary focus with funding was really drilled in on housing. They did realize, however, that in order to support the replacement of quality, affordable housing in many communities, there was a need to develop infrastructure that supported that housing development. So regardless of the demand, the private market just couldn't swing the cost of building a home to sell or rent at an affordable rate and also pay for the infrastructure needs without some kind of financial assistance. So they allowed for the creation of this infrastructure category, which DED followed up with. The goal then is ultimately to increase the availability of affordable housing. The infrastructure in support of housing category exists in both the DR 4317 and the DR 4451 funding categories. Consistent with all the funds under 4317, eligible applicants are the 55 declared counties with 80% of the funds directed at the mid-area zip codes. And you can see in the block above on this slide what those zip codes are and where they are generally located. Funds under the DR 4451 are directed at Cole, Holt, and St. Charles County, the only three mids under that disaster recovery 4451. The structure allows for units of local government to enter into development agreements with developers and development teams, both for profit and nonprofit, who need infrastructure to support the housing that they will build. The eligible activities and cost for the CDBG funds in the category include things like public water and sewer and stormwater, and it may also include roads or drainage as well. The infrastructure must be public infrastructure that CDBG DR funds is helping to build. It has to be necessary for the housing development and directly serve the housing development. Remember that no housing costs in this category are paid with CDBG DR funds. It's all focused on infrastructure that directly supports the housing development. The types of housing that may be supported by the infrastructure include single-family new construction for home ownership, multifamily, group homes, transitional housing. Those just name a few. The category is broad. Importantly, the type of housing must match the results of the needs assessment that came about in that specific area following the disaster. So you have to show a tie between the needs following the disaster and the type of housing that you're proposing to build. The national objectives could include low and moderate area benefit, where the 51% of the homes constructed must go to house low and moderate income, or low mod clientele, where the housing serves a particular group of persons, or low mod housing, where 100% of the housing serves 100% LMI. This slide just lays out those different options for national objectives with public improvements and public facilities. The national objective is met when the particular housing is occupied, not when the infrastructure is complete. The CDBG infrastructure has to serve people. It has to have specific beneficiaries in order for that national objective to have been fully met. So it's important to know that your project, while you're building infrastructure and while they're building housing, is not meeting a national objective until that housing is occupied, and occupied by the correct percentage of low and moderate income persons, depending on the housing that you're building or that the developer is building. The next slide then provides examples. I think the key to determining your national objective is determining who is benefiting, and then defining the service area of those beneficiaries. It's an infrastructure activity, not necessarily a housing activity. So in HUD world, we want to look at this in terms of infrastructure and the national objectives that go with infrastructure. The housing is just providing us beneficiaries who could count toward the national objective. But you can think of it as one example. If you're building new single-family homes in infill lots in an existing neighborhood and that doesn't have infrastructure currently, and maybe you're building new public sewer to serve, you're going to serve everybody in that neighborhood. So you have to count everybody in that service area in order to achieve the correct national objective. So understanding who's benefiting, what the service area is, and what your activity is will help you define what national objective that you need to meet and how you meet it. There's some project considerations when you partner with others that you need to take in order to create steps to assure project success. You want to obviously partner with experienced professionals. So because your partner is responsible for the development of the housing, you want to make sure you're partnering with a developer, again, private or nonprofit, that has experience in affordable housing development. You want to make sure that they have the means to construct the housing, the financial means, and they're financially sound, and they have the financial wherewithal to not only construct it, but to market it and to get it occupied, and if it requires a sale, to get it sold. Okay. Make sure you enter into contracts which spell out responsibilities and expectations and contain penalties for noncompliance. Since the entity that you're partnering with that's building the housing is ultimately responsible for your ability to meet the national objective, and if you don't meet a national objective, the funds must be returned. Make sure that your contracts reflect that. Also, make sure that you understand the product that they're providing, the product that they're building, and that it meets the needs of your community. Again, we want to match those needs to what you found in the needs assessment after the disaster, and we want to match the product that they're building to meet those needs. Finally, make sure that the public funds that you're expending for that infrastructure are needed for the housing development success. For 4317 applications for CDBG, they are limited to the lesser of 25% of total project costs, or $200,000 per project. For the 4451 MIDs, they can apply for up to $1 million. As Stacy said, these limitations, these budgeted amounts from CDBG are listed in the action plan, and you can find more information there. I can't stress enough that no CDBG funds in this category can be used for housing costs. And just note that this includes service taps. You cannot, a service tap is the line that brings the infrastructure, maybe it's a sewer or water, from the main line, which is the public infrastructure, across the private property to the house. That service tap is not public infrastructure, so it's not eligible for CDBG. That's a developer cost. So make sure that you're using your block grant funds for public infrastructure only, and that you're not putting any of them into the housing cost, and that you're applying and using the correct amount of limited funds limited to your particular disaster that you fall under. DED has established and published criteria for evaluation of project proposals, and they use a 100-point scale. These next two slides represent each of those criteria, and again, they're listed in the state action plan. So these last two slides represent the conclusion of the infrastructure and supportive housing category. And we will move next into the general infrastructure category. Remember, this is the second of the three that fall under the broader infrastructure category, and it's general infrastructure. And this category most closely mimics the infrastructure category found in the regular CDBG program you're all familiar with. The goals of the general infrastructure program include addressing remaining unmet needs and funding projects that have a dual benefit of increasing resilience. Here, the program's targeting the needs of the most vulnerable populations. Please note that only DR 4317 has a category called general infrastructure. So only applicants who fall under, only subrecipients who fall under the eligible defined areas for 4317 can apply for general infrastructure. Those applicants, again, can be the 55 counties, declared counties, but 80% of the funds are going to be directed at those zip codes that you see on the top right-hand side of the slide. Those are the most impacted and distressed areas in DR 4317. The eligible activities are typical activities related to infrastructure. They include acquisition, public infrastructure, and public buildings. I know that in the regular program, you separate the applications for public buildings like senior centers and things away from water and sewer, but here it can be, they can be combined. The payment of non-federal share of other matching programs is also an eligible use of these infrastructure funds, general infrastructure funds. So it's all of the typical eligible activities under general infrastructure are also under this program. Again, DED's created a selection process, and their evaluation criteria is again listed not only on this slide, but also in further detail in the action plan. Again, it's based on a 100-point scale. The last category then is the General Infrastructure Program MIT allocation. Okay, so it's the MIT. It's the mitigation funding that was separately received from HUD to the state of Missouri, or by the state of Missouri, to address infrastructure needs. And it's a little bit different. It's a new type of CDBG funding. It's only eligible to be accessed if you were part of the DR 4317 disaster. Okay, so if you were part of 4451, you cannot apply this time for the MIT funds. The funds are designed to address activities that will mitigate future disasters. As you all know, disaster recovery funds typically address or try to address the impacts of a disaster that has occurred in the near past. MIT funds instead look forward. They entertain activities that will mitigate or lessen the next disaster. Projects under this category that are applied for by applicants that are eligible for 4317 must meet the definition of mitigation, which is activities designed to increase resilience to disasters and reduce or eliminate the long-term risk of loss of life, injury, damage to, or loss of property and hardship by lessening the impact of future disasters. Activities funded must operate for both the useful life and be consistent with other MIT projects. They have to prioritize the protection of LMI. The idea of HUD is that there are other programs like the hazard mitigation funds that are received and through FEMA at the State Emergency Management Agency that are distributed after disasters that are for similar types of mitigation activities. What HUD is saying when activities funded must operate for the useful life and be consistent with other MIT projects, they're trying to complement those other mitigation projects that have occurred in the state, not compete with, but complement. Here, under this category, they're looking at 50% of the funds being directed at the MIT areas versus the 80%. So the 55 eligible counties have access to 50% of these funds in their applications. The next slide shows those counties, those 55 counties where the other 50% may occur. Again, then the 50% is focused on the 5 zip codes. As part of the required process to access the mitigation funds at the state level and the federal level, DED developed a risk-based mitigation needs assessment. Many of you participated in that, and it was designed to identify significant and current and future disaster risks in order to provide a basis for proposed impactful activities. Okay, so basically it was a way to focus the dollars in areas that would address the highest risk based on experience in Missouri. DED's evaluation included an evaluation of the state's geography, the climate trends, past disaster patterns, other resources that were available in their activities that they've undertaken, risks to critical services, risks to vulnerable population, and unmet needs. You can read the results of that in the action plan, but essentially as a result of that risk-based mitigation needs assessment, Missouri identified 3 critical areas of impact, and those areas of impact occur from thunderstorms, flooding, which is both riverine flooding and flash flooding, and tornadoes. DED took that information and designed this mitigation program around it. And the idea is that they want you to help alleviate and help mitigate some of the areas of highest risk that they've identified. There are 2 exceptions with MIT funds to the cross-cutting and category compliance requirements that we talked about earlier in the presentation. The first is that MIT projects can adopt another agency's environmental review, approval, or permit performed by a federal agency without review or public comment. And the second is that just by the definition alone, MIT projects do not require a tie back to the disaster. You remember Stacy talking about specifically how you had to tie your DR funds back to the disaster. Under the mitigation category, because it's forward-looking, there is obviously no tie-back requirement. So that becomes an exception to this program. Eligible applicants include the units of general local government within those declared 4317 counties. Obviously, also the communities that fall within the mid zip codes. But they also include regional planning commissions and councils of government who can apply for the planning funds that fall under this category as well. Units of general local government also have that opportunity to partner with other eligible entities to make applications for mitigation projects. And priority is actually placed on applicants that partner with RPCs as subrecipients. This chart depicts the eligible activities for the MIT program and the maximum grant award for each activity. So essentially, under the mitigation, DED created 5 different categories from which projects may be provided funding. There's a mitigation planning and capacity building category. There's a general infrastructure category. There's a public facility hardening category. There's a critical facilities generators category and a warning systems category. And you can see from this chart what the maximum award amount would be for each one of those categories. There is a limitation on the use of mitigation funds for eminent domain. So no eminent domain may be used for projects that use CDBG DR funds, except if the eminent domain is for public use only. So public use is defined specifically. It's for the purposes of eminent domain and the purposes of this program. Public use consists of mass transit, rail, airport, seaport, which we won't have unless there's a real problem, highway, utility, projects that serve the general public, water, sewer, energy, communication, et cetera. Those are public uses, and those are the definitions that fall under eminent domain. There is a prohibition to the assistance of using CDBG funds for private utilities and emergency response services. There's one other exception that needs to be, or actually, let's talk about national objective. The national objective, as we spoke earlier, is specific to each one of the categories. So you have to look at the category that you're in, whether you're in general infrastructure, whether you're in the infrastructure in support of housing, or whether you're in mitigation, to find out what the relevant national objectives are. But the interesting thing about mitigation is that national objectives can include LMI and urgent need. The usual requirement that 70% of all of the funds must be used under the LMI national objective is actually lowered to 50% in the mitigation category. The criteria to meet urgent need is waived, and an alternative requirement for urgent need has been established. So it's actually taking the typical definition of how to meet an urgent need national objective and creating a different way to do that. And the alternative requirement is described on the next slide. So if you have a project that's going to use urgent need as its national objective, to meet that alternative criteria, each subrecipient must document that the activity, one, addresses the current and future risks as identified in the state's mitigation needs assessment of those mid areas, and two, that it will result in a measurable and verifiable reduction in the risk of loss of life and property. So they're essentially saying, if you're going to use urgent need, you're going to have to tell us how the activity meets the need that was identified in the state's needs assessment and how that activity will measurably and verifiably reduce the hazard. The urgent need national objective will be used as follows. Infrastructure and public facility mitigation will keep roads and bridges operating in future disasters to a more similar nature. So it's designed to keep our infrastructure in operation. Critical facility generators will keep critical public facilities like hospitals or shelters, police departments open and operating to provide services to residents throughout the community. And warning systems will alert residents of impending hazardous conditions that will allow them to take safety precautions and secure property in advance of hazardous conditions. So they're giving you advice about how you can establish that tie, how you can start to come up with measures to show that you will achieve the urgent need requirements. The different categories under CDBG have different scoring criteria. And this slide describes the infrastructure and public improvements. The next few slides actually go through those different scoring criteria. So it's important that in any good application preparation that you understand what focus that you have and what outcomes you're driving for. The scoring criteria is a great way to understand what the goals of DED are in accomplishing the use of their disaster recovery funding. MIT also prescribes construction standards for projects. Transportation infrastructure has to meet the Missouri 2020 standard specs for highway construction, and project designs must incorporate resilience. So remember that as you are applying and building out any kind of project, you have to meet those additional requirements as well. That ends the explanation or the description of the three types of categories under the infrastructure broader category. And so I will pass it back to Stacy for the remainder of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sally. All right, we're going to move into the final few slides. So first, we are going to talk about use of CDBG as match. So Sally had mentioned very early on during the cross-cutting requirements some of the eligible activities, and she did briefly mention that CDBG funds could be used as a match. So we'll just dive into that a little bit more here. So when used to carry out any eligible activity, any eligible CDBG activity, funds may be used as either a matching requirement, a share, or a contribution for any other federal program. Okay, so this does include programs or activities that are administered by FEMA or the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Right, by law, the amount of CDBG funds that may be contributed to an Army Corps of Engineer project is $250,000 or less. Okay, when CDBG is used as a match for a FEMA public assistance project or a hazard mitigation grant program project, the match requirement for a CDBG is going to be 25% of the overall project cost. So Missouri has broken down that 25% share divided between the state and local government. So they've determined it at the state government contributing 10% and local government at 15%. Okay, and if you are interested in using CDBG as match and want some more information, there is additional information located in the General Infrastructure Policy on DED's website. Okay, now we will get into monitoring closeout and any further compliance. All right, so, as we mentioned pretty early on, kind of under the risk assessment section, we did talk about that there will be ongoing monitoring and compliance for all projects being implemented with either DR or MIT funds. Okay, so there are a number of activities. I'm not going to read through all of these. Most of them were covered in either the cross-cutting section or the category compliance section. So it just talks about most of the requirements and regulations that were covered under those sections. Okay, and also, as we mentioned during the risk assessment slide, the level of monitoring may vary depending on the individual subrecipient agreement and the scope of work. But at a minimum, there are certain requirements that the subrecipients are responsible for. And again, some of this was discussed during the subrecipient responsibility section, but just to touch on a few, following all procurement guidelines and processes, and that does relate to requirements outlined in 2 CFR, as well as state procurement policies. Additionally, for any local standards, so whatever is the higher of all of those standards is what should be followed. Okay, and kind of following up on procurement, anytime as a subrecipient, if you enter into any contract, it is your responsibility to monitor that contracted entity for compliance with all required federal standards. Okay, also, as we talked about, financial management and oversight, and most importantly, complying with all of the terms and conditions that are laid out in the grant agreement that you would enter into with DED. Okay, also there are additional reporting requirements. So we did touch on some of these previously, but these requirements do include reporting all awarded contracts to DED, staying current with all quarterly performance reports, and making sure that all activities, all agreed upon activities are completed in accordance with the project completion dates, and keeping DED apprised of any scheduling delays so that that can be addressed as needed. Okay, closeout. So the closeout process will begin when subrecipients are set to receive their final assistance payment and are approaching the end of their project. Okay, for all construction projects, DED will retain the final construction payment until the certification of completion is submitted, and all documentation, which does include the national objective documentation and all reporting requirements, are met. Okay, so we just want to make sure that everything is compliant. All documentation has been provided before that final retainage payment is paid out. Okay, just to dig into closeout a little further, so some general things to look out for when to prepare for project closeout. A project is ready for closeout when all eligible activities were completed and that it has been determined that they met a national objective. Okay, additionally, when all grant funds were expended in full, and if there is any overage of funding, that the remaining funds have been planned to be returned to DED. As mentioned on the previous slide, when all reporting requirements have been met, and additionally, when all conditions of the grant were met, and if there were any audits during the project implementation, that any audit or monitoring issues affecting the grant were resolved. Okay, so closeout cannot occur until all of these conditions have been met. Okay, and the project would be considered officially closed out by DED when the subrecipient has met all of these requirements and DED approves all of the national objective documentation. Okay, recapture of funds. This is not something that we, hope to happen, but we do need to cover it regardless. And again, this is why we talk about the ongoing monitoring just to ensure that everything is compliant in order to avoid a recapture of funds. But there are certain circumstances in which a subrecipient may be required to repay all or some of the program funds. So just to touch on a few of those, again, as we talked about, it is a requirement to comply with all of the terms of their SRA. If for whatever reason all the terms were not complied with, that may result in the recapture of funds. If the subrecipient does not complete the project and they choose to withdraw from the program for a variety of reasons, or if they complete the project and do not meet the national objective that was set out in the application. Okay. Additionally, if it is found that program funds were used for any additional activity or cost, or if it's been found that there has been a duplication of benefits. Okay, so again, just to emphasize on that, it's not prohibited to obtain additional funding as long as it's confirmed that any additional funding does not constitute a duplication of benefits. Okay, so in the event that if any additional funding becomes available during the life of the project, that must be reported to DED to ensure that there is no duplication of benefits. Okay, and the last reason why recapture of funds may occur is if there are any funds remaining after the project is completed, or if the expenditure deadline has passed and all funds have not been expended. Okay, record keeping. So it's really important to remember that all files and records must be kept at the subrecipient's business offices, and they must be made available to the public during regular business hours. This obviously excludes any confidential files relating to housing or economic development, but that likely will not be occurring under the infrastructure program. Additionally, all applicant and program data must be retained for at least 5 years after the project closeout. Okay, subrecipients are required to control grant funds and establish adequate safeguards to protect the records that document any CDBG financial transactions. Okay, and kind of on that note, talking about financial transactions, record retention requirement does apply to any source documentation, which refers to any writing that activates a flow of funds. So that can refer to purchase order, invoice, any checks, any budget transfers, just anything that involves the flow of funds. Okay, and lastly, there is a process for appeals. So if during the application process, if either your application is not approved, your budget was not approved for any variety of reasons in which an appeal might be necessary, if you are not happy with the outcome of any determination made by DED, there is a formal appeals process. So this process may include, but is not limited to any informal hearings, third-party review, or director approval. So in order to submit an appeal, it must be submitted within 45 days of the date on the face of the determination letter. Okay, so once that determination letter is sent, based on the date of when that letter was written, the subrecipient or applicant would have 45 days to appeal any decisions on that. Okay, so I won't read through the entire process, but again, there is a formal process for submitting an appeal in which DED is required within 15 days of receiving the appeal to confirm the receipt. At which point they would review it for completeness and accuracy, go back to the applicant if there was any documentation missing. Okay, it would get assigned to a staff member. And then that staff member would contact the applicant, again, if there's any additional evidence or information that's needed in order to make a determination on the appeal. Okay, and then again, within 10 days of receipt, DED will make a determination that the application was properly processed, or they will note any changes or corrections that have occurred. Okay, and then lastly, within 45 days of initial receipt of the appeal, the applicant will be sent a formal letter from DED with the final appeal determination. Okay, so that concludes our presentation. We thank you all for joining us, and additional information can always be found on Missouri DED's website. So thank you all.